So before I begin today, I'd like to thank Tom, Matt, and Dominic for putting together this great conference. And I'd say that unfortunately Professor Katz couldn't make it here, but I've worked with him on the past 3 years on this project, and it's been not only a pleasure, but it's been a great experience and definitely a meaningful part of my undergraduate education. So starting. So on weekday mornings, white jitney vans scurry along the streets of Paris and New Jersey, stopping to pick up passengers. Their destination reads New York City. They're owned by Peruvian immigrants who transpose the transportation practice common in Lima. They're one of the modalities for moving Paris's increasingly immigrant working age population to jobs outside the city, with a large majority of them. In 3 immigrant cities, which are the focus of our research, Paris and Passaic, New Jersey, and Bridgeport, Connecticut, between 75% and 87% of the employed population work outside of their city of residence. These small and medium-sized cities have become the source of low-wage labor for the municipalities which surround them. Their historic function has changed. Formerly exporters of manufactured goods, they are now exporters of human capital. At the same time, these cities are also experiencing immigrant-led urban revitalization. Revitalization is a term bandied about in urban studies literature, but rarely defined. To us, urban revitalization consists of increases in population, commerce, occupancy, leisure and entertainment venues, services, and safety. Although these features of the revitalization process form package, population increase comes first. The process is facilitated by distinctive types of private agency and by sets of public-private relationships, embodied often in special services districts and community development corporations. In Patterson, for example, the New Jersey Community Development Corporation and the Hamilton Partnership. This revitalization follows roughly half a century of devitalization. Devitalization refers to a decrease in each of the factors listed above: depopulation, dying downtowns, vacant storefronts, disappearing movie theaters and restaurants, bank closings, rising crime rates. Together, these squeeze the life and vitality out of older American cities. There, what revitalization, often led by immigrants, has begun to turn around. Immigrant-led revitalization in small, medium-sized cities does not depend on reindustrialization or even the widespread prior availability of semi- and low-skilled work. Nor is it accompanied at first by a decline in official poverty or a rise in real estate values. Rather, at its core, it is residential, driven by newcomers who increase populations, form new communities, establish small businesses and services, but work for the most part outside the city. Most of the abundant new literature on recent immigration concentrates on traditional immigrant ports of entries and on new and emergent immigrant gateways. As in urban studies literature more generally, small and medium-sized cities remain relatively neglected. However, these cities house a significant fraction of the populations, and they are home to huge numbers of immigrants. Indeed, in 2010, 61% of the U.S. foreign-born lived in municipalities with a population less than 200,000, but 12% in cities between 100,000 and 199,000, 33% in cities and towns of 20 to 99,000, and 16% in smaller places. At least in the Rust Belt, immigration, in fact, is transforming the demographies, economies, and spatial organizations of these small and medium-sized cities. The stories of Patterson, Passaic, and Bridgeport thus form a part of a more widespread and significant narrative. The basic facts about these cities are told easily and repeat a familiar story. Figure 1 traces their populations from the early 20th century through 2010. Despite some variation, there's a similar tale of growth, decline, and growth resuming, with the turnaround in population beginning in the last decades of the 20th century. Population growth coincided with the in-migration of foreign-born residents in these cities. Early in the 20th century, each housed a substantial number of immigrants. In 1910, the foreign-born populations composed between 36% and 53% of their populations. Adding in the second generation, the children of immigrants, boost the foreign stock population between 73% and 82%. Truly, these were immigrant cities. With the nationality-based quotas of the 1920s, the Great Depression, and World War II, immigration largely dried up. In each city, the proportion of foreign-born residents reached its nadir in 1970, about the same time as the lowest point in its population history. The growth of immigrant populations in each city rebounded with the national upsurge in immigration in the decades after the 1965 repeal of the quota legislation, as Figure 2 shows. Today, these are once again immigrant cities. The foreign-born comprise between 26% and 46% of their official 2010 populations. Including undocumented immigrants would raise the population, or would raise the percentage a substantial but indeterminable amount. Adding in the children of immigrants who are under 18 shows that the foreign-born stock between 35% and 62%. Unfortunately, a limitation of the American Community Survey is that it fails to include adults whose parents are foreign-born, which undoubtedly deflates the percentages provided above. In the early 20th century, the immigrant population of these cities originally primarily in Europe. Today they come from Central and Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia. Bundled together, the largest group is Hispanic. About half of the populations, although it's labeled mass the diversity in the population ordinance, lumping together quite demographically and socially diverse groups. As, for example, in Patterson, there are Dominicans, Peruvians, and Puerto Ricans, all under this label. It was manufacturing jobs that attracted immigrants in the early 20th century. With no public transportation in the age before the automobile, immigrants needed to walk to where they worked. This meant that these cities, out of necessity, were both the place of work and residence for their new arrivals. The availability of manufacturing work attracted and held them. About 53% in each city worked in manufacturing. In the late 20th and early 21st century, this relationship between work and residence changed. The availability of manufacturing work no longer served as the principal source of attraction. In fact, the proportion of the population employed in manufacturing continued to decline, dropping to around 6% in 2010. Instead, immigrants worked most often in service sector jobs, transportation, and construction. The widespread availability of buses and private automobiles enabled them to find work outside the cities in which they lived. And this, as we've noted, is what they did. And this is seen in Figure 3. The proportion of employed residents working elsewhere in 2010 was 80% in Patterson, 87% Passaic, and 75% in Bridgeport. In Patterson, 40,000 of the 50,000 employed residents worked outside the city. A substantial number of immigrants did open small businesses, restaurants and enterprises, providing local services to meet the needs of the new ethnic communities. It is not clear how many of these ethnic businesses are owned by city residents and how many are owned by ethnic entrepreneurs who live elsewhere. They do, however, provide a modest amount of low-skilled employment for local residents. As part of our larger project, we are analyzing the size and geography of businesses in these cities. At this point, we can see that most of the businesses in these cities are truly small. Taking the three cities together in 2010, 50% of businesses employed at most one person, 29% employed 2 to 5, and only 11% more than 50. From their names, it is clear that many serve the immigrant community. El Temprano Restaurant, Gonzalez Travel Agency, Turkish Grill and Cafe, De Leon Money Transfer, the Arab Voice, and the Oficina del Voto Dominicano. Driving to Patterson from the west, the main street is lined with small businesses serving the local population. The lack of vacant storefronts is remarkable. Similarly, the automobile traffic downtown is heavy. Most, although not all, storefronts are occupied with low-end retail and services, surviving despite a new downtown mall. Continuing through the immigrant neighborhoods, the observer is struck by tidy small homes and neighborhood bodegas, a vibrant Arab quarter centered around the southern section of Main Street. The new residents sustain these businesses. They bring life to the streets, they inject cash in the economy. But for the most part, they leave the city to work. We cannot identify the ethnic origins and birthplaces of the workers who leave the cities for employment. However, there is no doubt that a high fraction of the workers exported by these cities are foreign-born. Indeed, during a period of immigration growth, the average percentage working outside the city of residence increased from 62% in 1990 to 81% in 2000. The labor force exported by these workers were primarily in low-wage jobs in retail, healthcare, and human services, as well as in construction and transportation. In Patterson, 16% of residents who worked outside the city are employed in good producing industries, which include construction work and small-scale goods production, as well as more conventional manufacturing. 27% in trade, transportation, utilities, which encompasses retail, and 58% in all their services, which is where the healthcare and human services workers are found. The working population can be divided into three groups. Residents who work outside the city, non-residents who work in the city, and residents who work in the city. In economic terms, the non-residents do the best. The residents who remain in the city do the worst. The data allows us to divide the workforce into 3 groups by income. As you can see, $1,250 a month or less, $1,250 to about $3,333, and $3,333 or more. For purposes of discussion, we will call these low, medium, high, although the latter is high only in this context. A quarter of the residents who work outside the city earn low incomes and 24% high incomes. By contrast, 46% of non-residents working in the cities earned high incomes, contrasted to only 21% of residents who worked in the city. Of the latter, 31% found themselves in the lowest income category. The immigrant residents who leave the city for work each day, by and large, lack the education needs for the city's better jobs, and they may be hindered by the lack of language skills as well. But they're welcome, indeed needed by the by the restaurants, nursing homes, supermarkets, construction, and unskilled or semi-skilled manufacturing in the towns and cities within commuting distance. Despite the recent arrival of marginal English ability and limited schooling, the labor force participation rates of the foreign-born men are higher than those of either native-born whites or African Americans. In a sample drawn from the northern New Jersey cities for 2011, among 18 to 64-year-old men, the labor force participation rate was 88% for the foreign-born, compared to 84% for native whites and 67% for African Americans. At the same time, bundling incomes within households partially offsets low wages paid to immigrants. Indeed, taking the median for these 3 cities, the foreign-born household heads earned about 55% of total household income, compared to 69% of native-born. These cities have always produced and exported products. Late 19th and early 20th century, manufactured goods composed their primary export. Today's people, largely for low-skilled and semi-skilled jobs. Most accounts of the history of urban economies trace a trajectory from manufacturing to services. While this is valid for these small cities, another coexistent trajectory also captures their history: the transition from an economy based on the export of goods to one based on the export of human labor. The exchange of workers between municipalities shows that there is not only a deficit in jobs that motivate residents of our cities to look elsewhere for work. In Paris, 28,000 members of the workforce lived outside the city. These cities contain, in fact, many solid middle-class jobs, such as teachers, policemen, firemen, municipal officials, and healthcare technicians, to name some of the most obvious. Anecdotal evidence supported by the incomes and occupational data shows that the better jobs, by and large, go to workers who enter these cities from other municipalities. In Paris, we are told most of the teachers, policemen, and firemen live outside the city. So do the attorneys who flock to the city, because it is a county seat. The young staff of a CDC we interviewed either lived outside the city or hoped to depart soon. In Patterson, anecdotal evidence is clear and consistent. Departure for residents, if not always work in the suburbs, usually accompanies economic mobility. Now, the one exception is city politicians. One of the upwardly mobile young city politicians with whom we talked to lives in one of the old factory buildings converted into loft. The situation thus differs from the conditions discussed in spatial mismatch literature. The spatial mismatch theory applies to persons already living in a city whose economy has been decimated by deindustrialization and the movement of businesses to suburbs. They are people left behind, unable to reach jobs. In the situation we describe, population growth occurs after deindustrialization. In migrants choose cities where local jobs for them are limited in number. Industrious, family-centered, often entrepreneurial immigrants do more than provide these formerly manufacturing cities with a new export, human labor. They also reduce crime. Indeed, immigration has exerted an astounding impact on crime rates within the cities. Figure 7 traces the correspondence between the growth of an immigrant population in the 1990s and the decrease in crime. Taking the average of the 3 cities, crime rates per 100,000 population plummeted from just over 8,000 in 1990 to 4,000 in 2010. Other scholars, notably Robert Sampson and John McDonald, have discovered similar reductions in crimes associated with the growth of immigrant population. Reductions larger in cities lacking large numbers of immigrants. So, what's the significance of these trends? Why does it matter that extraordinary proportions of residents work outside the cities in which they live? First, the pattern we have points to a historically unprecedented shift in the relation between the place of work and residence among working class immigrants in small and medium-sized cities, which, in an ironic twist, has taken on the historic functions of suburbs. In post-World War II America, middle-class and affluent suburbs became classic veteran communities. Now this function has been assumed by these new immigrant municipalities. Only it is more appropriate to think of them as reservations for low-wage labor than as bedroom communities. And we use the term reservation in the dictionary sense of an area of land set aside for occupation. The price of housing in the neighboring municipality acts as an informal market-led agency of exclusion, preventing the entrance of an immigrant working class to the high cost of housing. Working class immigrants are not forced into small, medium-sized cities which have become their homes, as Native Americans were forced on the reservations. And they are not excluded from the more affluent municipalities by explicitly segregation mechanisms. The barriers, instead, are neutral market mechanisms. But they have the same effect of concentrating them in a space and leaving them few residential alternatives. These neutral market mechanisms help produce growth in suburban poverty and distress exposed by recent census data. Second, the proximity of non-resident low-wage labor force serve nearby municipalities well. They do not have to educate the children of immigrants, pay for affordable subsidized housing, pick up the local costs associated with poverty, or manage ethnic diversity. Instead, they can draw on as they need a ready, flexible pool of reliable workers to care for their elderly, work the cash registers in their supermarkets, wash dishes in their restaurants, clean the rooms of their hotels, and tend their lawns, all with the minimum responsibility for their well-being. Looked in another way, however, the picture does not appear as bleak or exploitative. From the viewpoint of struggling cities in which they live, these immigrant workers, regardless of where they're employed, bring population growth, increased tax revenue, commercial revival, and cultural vitality, in addition to lowering crime rates. Immigrants compose the key engines driving these cities on the road to revitalization. Revitalization also embraces civil society and civic movement. Take, for example, Union City, New Jersey, a small northern New Jersey city, long ago center of the lace-making industry, not primarily Hispanic and poor, a city much like nearby Paris and Marseille. In his gripping account of the stunning about-face of the city's deteriorating public schools and improbable scholars, the rebirth of a great American school system and a strategy for America's school, David L. Kirk points out that despite its grim statistical portrait, Union City remains vibrant. Civil life is thriving. The many enclaves that comprise this community are flourishing. The municipality of Latino cultures, the Mexican Americans, Ecuadorian Americans, and Colombian Americans, each with their own Native American association. The Muslim and Hasidic Jews, each with its own house of worship and its own schools. And the newest arrivals from countries like India and Yemen. Despite the grim figures, Union City would surely rank high in a survey of personal happiness. So from the point of view of immigrants, these cities offer inexpensive housing, the security and comfort of living among co-ethnics, proximity jobs, and an opportunity to bundle the incomes of household members. They also hold out the promise of social mobility for a second generation. These small, medium-sized cities may be reservations for low-wage labor, but they also provide the first tentative steps towards the realization of the American dream.